Now we just learned about useEffect, which I mentioned would be the most important React hook besides useState. Are you ready for the next React hook, useReducer? Now useReducer is another built-in hook, and it will help us with state management. So it's a bit like useState, but actually with more capabilities and especially useful for more complex state. Because sometimes you have more complex state, for example, multiple states that kind of belong together, that are managing the same thing, just different aspects of it. Or you have multiple states that kind of change together or are related. In such cases, use state and the state you get from there often becomes hard or error prone to use and manage. And it's easy then to write bad or inefficient or potentially buggy code, which is of course never what we want. useReducer is then an alternative to use state. So it's a replacement if you need a more powerful state management. Now this does not mean that you should always use useReducer, because it's more powerful, so it's always better, right? No, because it's also a bit more complex to use, it requires a bit more setup. So for a lot of scenarios, for the majority I would argue, you probably use useState. But there are cases where the extra work of getting useReducer to work is just worth it. That's all very abstract. What would be a concrete example? We can again go back to the good old login.js file here. Here, you see, I'm managing a couple of state snapshots, and you might be able to spot some related state here. We manage the entered email and the entered password, but then we also manage the fact or the question, the response to the question, whether the email or the password is valid, and we manage the overall form validity. So you could argue that overall, this is all one big state that describes the overall form state. The inputs are part of that. Or you at least treat every input as one entity and one state, which simply has two aspects: the value the user entered and the validity of that input. And it becomes clear that we have some work to do and some redundancy if we consider the fact that we're setting the overall form validity by checking the validity of email and password when we're doing the exact same thing here for our two validate handlers. Now we could rewrite this in various ways and, for example, use our email is valid and password is valid states here in this useEffect and just use those two states to confirm whether the overall form is valid, and that would work. But nonetheless, we at least have these two states, the entered email in this example and the validity of the email, that clearly kind of belong together and which we therefore might want to manage together. In addition, I want to come back to something which we don't have anymore because we're using useEffect, but what we had before. If I comment out useEffect here, before you might remember that inside of email change handler and password change handler, we had a slightly different code. We had this code here essentially, not just in the email change handler, but also in the password change handler, where we checked the other entered value and the entered value for this handler with event target value, and we would derive the form validity from that. Now, this approach also worked, but we had some code reusage, which is why the effect was a better result. But let's say for whatever reason you don't want to take that route to useEffect. In that case, you would have another problem, and I'm just going back to the solution to show you this problem, which you can have in some apps and in some use cases. Here, we are updating some state, the form validity state, based on two other states. Now, what did you learn about updating the state based on some older state? You want to use the function form, right? Now, this doesn't work here, however, because that's only true if your next state update depends on the previous state snapshot of the same state. But here we depend on two other state snapshots of different state, of the entered email and the entered password, not on the last state snapshot of the form validity. So therefore here actually we're doing something which you normally shouldn't do. Because of the way React schedules state updates, this code here could actually, in rare cases, but it could actually lead to the scenario where this runs before, for example, password state update was processed. So therefore, entered password, when this code runs, might not contain the latest entered password because of how React schedules state updates. That's what I preached before and why I urged you to use the function form. But again, it's not available here because we're depending on two other states and not the last snapshot of this form validity state. This is another scenario where you could use useReducer. So it's a good use case, a good replacement of useState when you have state that belongs together, like here with the entered value and the validity of the value, and or if you have state updates that depend on other state. And actually, we don't even have to go back to this code. We already violate this rule of using the function form if a state update depends on an older state here in our validate email and validate password handlers. There we are calling set email is valid and set password is valid to set new states for this email is valid and password is valid state. These are our two states which we're setting there. Now, how are we setting these states? Well, by having a look at another state and calling a method on it. So we're having a look at the entered email state, which is a different state. This is our entered email state. It's a different state than our email is valid state. Sure, they are related. They both change because of what the user entered, but technically, these are two different states, two different variables. And we are deriving our new email is valid state by looking at another state. And that is something we should not do. It works in most cases, but in some scenarios it could not work because maybe some state update for entered email wasn't processed in time. And then we would try to update email is valid based on some outdated entered email state. So we should use the function form here, but again, just as with set form is valid, we can't, because with the function form of our state updating function here, we only get the latest state for that state which we're setting here. So we would get the latest email is valid state, not the latest entered email state if we use the function form here. So that's why this is not an option. And therefore here we are already violating this rule, which I told you to, well, not violate. And that is a scenario where useReducer is always a good choice. If you update a state which depends on another state, then merging this into one state could be a good idea, and you can do that without useReducer as well. You could simply manage an email state, which is an object with the value and the valid being part of the same object. You could do that with useState. But in such cases, when your state becomes more complex, bigger, and combines multiple related states, useReducer can also be worth a closer look. And that's why we'll dive into it in the next lecture.